So I have a collection of questions here. We're happy to have more come in. I thought I would start out with one. It sort of jumped to my mind since this is a symposium on political discourse. It might be useful to start out by having some of the panelists talk about what they view as the relationship between campaign finance, spending, and campaign finance reform on the discourse surrounding elections. So perhaps a couple of you or all of you want to comment on that. We have about 30, 35 minutes for questions. I have a decent stack here, so let's not use it all on my question.
I can start off. I would say that the implications of the outside money, the literature would show us, has been that it makes campaigns more negative. The implicit division of labor between the teammates is that the outside groups will do the attack, and the candidate campaigns will be responsible for the positive messaging, candidate definition kinds of ads. And the assumption in the past has been that the candidates were going to be responsible, or the parties, for the get out the vote efforts. Clearly that was the Obama model. So I think one of the implications of outside money is it leads to more negative campaigning than we would otherwise have, although I think there's lots of reasons why campaigns will go negative themselves.
I think we agree.
Okay.
Actually, I'm not sure I do. In the days of soft money for the parties in the 90s, it was the parties who spent on negative ads. And so in the absence of some other organization that's going to do that, the parties are certainly going to jump in. I mean, they do it in part because the perception, at least, is that they work. They provide information for people. Sometimes it's uncomfortable and even unseemly, but people seem to learn from it to some extent. It's not as effective as door-to-door, but it's still there. It also generates 15% to the people who buy that television time. And so to some extent, we have a system that's captured by the professionals who run it.
Right.
And it's their incentives that are often as important as the incentives of the candidates, who are risk averse, we heard, and so they're not going to take a chance. But the discourse, I'm not sure it's so different.
Well, no, I should thank you, because I think it prompts a qualification to the statement. I think party soft money was outside money. It couldn't be coordinated with the candidates, and it was very much like issue advocacy and super PAC spending today. And party committees used soft money for voter activation purposes, the 72-hour task force kinds of expenditures. So, fair point.
So I have an excellent stack of questions here. Your comments reminded me of one of them. You talked about the people running the campaign committees, thinking about the structure of the system, not wanting to change it. One of the questions was, all of the people who would be voting to reform the system are incumbents, and in most cases have at least not done too poorly in the system because they were elected. And so if you could talk a little bit about what it would take to get the incumbents who have succeeded in the system to consider reforming it.
That's an excellent
Yeah, I
question.
mean, anybody could.
Right, because I would like to point out on that note that if you look at the 1974 FICA Act in particular, you will see that the way that it treats presidential candidates is far more restrictive and punitive than the way they treated themselves. And this is legislation that was written with the help of some outside groups, but of course drafted by members of Congress. And a lot of the things that came even out of the first important Supreme Court case, Buckley versus Vallejo, that were striking down things even that made Congress freer. So that's a great, it's going to be very difficult.
The common answer is that they need to feel uncomfortable, so uncomfortable about the system as it works, that they feel like they need to change it for their own protection. That was the case in 1974 after the Nixon campaign. Everybody felt like the system was rigged and it wasn't fair and it was in fact criminal in some cases. And so we needed to change it. The same thing happened in 2002. It took a long time to get there, but the soft money system for the parties became really untoward, and Congress felt like they needed to change it in order to protect themselves. So in history, that's the mechanic that works.
I would just jump in and say that a lot of this is practical, but there are also some philosophical considerations. Generally speaking, Republicans believe in the free market of ideas, They do not want government regulation, and they generally don't want welfare for politicians, and that's how this is often phrased. Democrats swing a little bit more towards equality and the little man, and they favor more regulation. They tend to favor public funding and things of those sorts. Once you get beyond philosophy and you get to the practical politics, there's partisanship. You don't want to anger your leaders, even if you disagree with some of the reforms they're backing or opposing. But most of all, you don't want to upset your constituents. And that means your voting constituents who may be aware of such a bill, which happens following a major crisis like the Watergate crisis or the Keating 5 scandal or any of those kinds, or the Enron scandal, or any of those kinds of things. And then the second constituency, which is your financial constituency. Members of Congress, candidates for almost all office, wage two campaigns, one for votes and the other for resources, and they need to make their constituents happy, but also not eliminate parts of those constituencies. If we think about how women raise their money, it differs from men. Women's money is generally more national, given more by women themselves. And men tend to raise most of their money, well, they raise it nationally, but not so much from women. And there are ethnic and racial networks. One of the big issues is how much money lives in is in your constituency. People who live in wealthy constituencies like suburban Connecticut, New York City area, Hollywood, Houston, they can raise their money at home, and they would surely back the incumbents' bills that would say, okay, you can only raise money from in your district, whereas candidates from less wealthy districts, particularly challengers, need to rely on money nationally. So there are a whole slew of philosophical, partisan, as well as practical considerations that stand in the way of reform. And of course, incumbents hold different positions from challengers, often until the challengers become incumbents.
Fred, let me just add one thing. I think there's a difference between how incumbents deal with laws they get to write, which tend to be favorable to themselves, and laws they inherit from the court. And the example of the second category would be the super PACs phenomenon. And what's fascinating to me is the extent to which there's learning going on at different levels or in different institutions. So we saw these candidate-aligned super PACs first in the presidential race, but now they are becoming much more commonplace in congressional races. So there's ongoing adaptation in both parties and across institutions. And so we're going to see in 2016 far more Senate candidate-specific super PACs formed and even more House candidate-specific aligned super PACs formed, which tends to alter in some ways the ways the parties interact and the way donors are going to be interacting and the campaign dynamics for the reasons we've talked about.
Thank you. We appear to have a wealthy benefactor in our midst. I am writing a multi-million-dollar check to a PAC. What is the expected return on investment to justify such an amount, or is it purely emotionally or philosophically driven? What's the return on this?
It better be to a super PAC that can accept unlimited contributions from a variety of sources, or it's illegal. Many of us have worked for Congress, and I've seen a member blow his stack and throw a union leader or union lobbyist out of his office because the lobbyist said, Congressman, we supported you, and now we'd like you to help us out and back our bill. And he said, are you suggesting a quid pro quo? I know you're new at this job, and I'm going to ask you to leave now, but if you ever come in with that line again, I'm going to call your boss and have you fired. And this is a very powerful member of the House. It was quite amazing. What's your payback? Generally, we know from the political science literature is that you will at least get a voice with a member of Congress, a meeting, that someone else probably will not. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. If you're the leader of a major organization that doesn't give contributions but has a big impact on the district, sure you'll get in. But money is one of those things that will help. The other way that you get a return on your investment is if there's little turnover, there's little change. And political scientists and some economists for years have been chasing the relationship between money and roll call votes and having a lot of difficulties methodologically, but also empirically finding it. And part of the reason is most of these established groups that continue to give large amounts of money, continue to lobby, support the status quo. And the status quo is very hard to change in a system that has so many veto points, separation of powers, federalism, and all those things. So I don't think you're going to get a huge return, but you certainly are going to get some great pictures and great stories.
The returns are almost never so incremental. It's almost never, I'll give you this, so I get this specific thing in return. The courts say that's where you can regulate things. You can limit contributions for individual people because I'm giving you something, so maybe I expect something in return. So the government's allowed to protect itself from that kind of specific. A lot of times I think they're ideological, especially when they get to that size. People are really strong believers in a way that the government should work, in a perspective. Sometimes they're playing a very long game. I think the wealthy benefactors for libertarian kinds of orientations now are really trying to change the way the government functions. And if it takes 20 years or 30 years or more, that's okay. We can do that. And so it's not so much what am I going to get tomorrow, it's how can I shape the process going forward so that someday we'll have a government that actually works the way I think it should.
Well, I would respond in a similar vein. It's true that political science has not been successful in finding the smoking gun. There's no receipt, for one amendment, this amount receipt. But the other way to look at it for the multimillionaire is that maybe you're not buying change, you're buying the status quo. That the status quo works for you, and so what you would like is to make sure that there isn't a change. There are a couple other things in here. One is that there has been a little study of some of these people as hobbyists. Some really rich people like to race yachts, and some of the rich people, like Paul Person is saying, like to collect photographs, cufflinks, and stories, and point to their friends and say, "See that ad, last week?" That was me. Right. So there's a little bit of that. But finally, to the status quo, I often tell my students to think of this in terms of your car insurance. We all pay for car insurance, but after 20, 30 years of paying your auto insurance, and you can pay a substantial amount over that period of time, you don't say, well, gee, you know what, let me wrap my car around a tree, because I need to collect on that investment. If you're lucky, you'll never collect. And so if you think about why some people who have a lot of potential stakes are making the outlays that they are, this is the same, similar kinds of things. And maybe, and the story that Paul told is great because a lot of us have similar stories, but when you're in trouble, you call your agent up and you say, I have a claim to make. And think of it that way, that is what a lot of big investors in the system want, is that should they need it, they could have the access, but they prefer not to ever use it.
A couple of thoughts. One is building on the access point, I think, and the hobbyist point. I think there are good examples of that. My favorite example would be Foster Friess, who was Santorum's sidekick. You'll remember that in Iowa, and often appeared with him on the stage. So this is the major benefactor of the Santorum Super PAC. Obviously, part of the inner circle that comes down onto the stage after Santorum's on election nights as that race unfolded. So you get access, and in some cases you may get really extraordinary access to the candidate. I think ideological is a major motivation, and part of this is the relative wealth of the individuals. I mean, we think of this as a lot of money. I'm not sure they think of it as a lot of money, and therein lies an interesting distinction. Now, if you are an investor that's in it for the long term, not just this election cycle, then there's a whole array of investment options that we can put before you, including think tanks on both sides, ideological groups. Just in the super PACs area, if you don't want to really go in just for one candidate, then you can give to Crossroads and trust Karl Rove and Mr. Law and others, or you can give to the Senate Majority PAC or the House Majority PAC on the Democratic side. and trust them, as a good broker would do, to allocate your millions appropriately. But you may be really aware that having really good video archives of misstatements made in Indiana Senate races, for example, might be useful. And so you might be willing to give $5 million to your party to build the data archive to help every other super PAC have the ability to respond. Highly specialized investment options that are now developing within this world of mega donors. And then you can go to an LLC and form a data archive. Both parties now have them. 200 million names. They know all about those 200 million people, such that they can profile you for purposes of mobilization, fundraising, and other things. Again, funded initially by people who are willing to invest, in this case in an LLC at Catalyst, in a similar entity on the Republican side, plus an additional entity funded by the Koch brothers network. So there's a lot of ways to spend your money.
And then there's the example of the state of North Carolina, where a fellow named Art Pope, who's the Tom Steyer or David Koch of North Carolina, invested in lots of legislative races over a few years, invested in getting a Republican elected governor of North Carolina. Now, and again, it's not just the money that does this, but certainly it was important to him. And his payoff was a bureaucratic job. He became the budget director for the state of North Carolina. He didn't need the salary, but he wanted to change the way budgeting worked in the state. He wanted to change the way we use public money, and he wanted to do it directly. He's a hands-on kind of guy. He ran businesses, and so he was happy to do that. So sometimes it can be kind of more overt.
I'm going to try and do a couple of quick questions here that I think are partly clarifications or just general information, response to some of the presentations. So let me start here. How much money comes from foreign interests?
I can tell you an anecdote.
That may be a long answer, it sounds like.
You know, I guess the best answer is, for the most part, we don't know. But at one point in my career, I did a political audit for a major foreign company that had a U.S. subsidiary. And they asked me to come in, and I said, well, if I'm going to come in, I'm going to do some work and we'll talk. So I looked up their political action committee, and the biggest donor gave the legal maximum, $5,000, had a very foreign-sounding name, and was the head of the company and did not reside in the United States. So I showed up, and I commented them about their PAC holding back some money so they could give it to people who defeated the incumbents that they supported, kiss and make up money, and the PAC director and everyone glowed with pride. I said, it's great the way you've reserved some funds for this and that, but I have a question. This person here, is he an American citizen? Because if he's not, it's illegal. Well, everyone turned beet red. The meeting ended, and they sent me a check and said, you know, I think maybe we shouldn't keep you going. And then I checked the records that Bob is in charge of keeping, and that contribution had been withdrawn. But that's an example. And it was an example before we had the internet set up the way it is and before social media, that if it had happened now, this candidate, this PAC would have been in trouble, and the candidates that received PAC money might have been in jeopardy because they would have been associated with foreign contributions, and that could have been a scandal. So I don't think it's much, but we don't really know. I think these new groups, it's hard to tell.
That's a pretty innocent example. That was almost surely done from ignorance. We didn't realize I couldn't give this contribution. And it was disclosed, so obviously they weren't trying to hide very much. I did, at the end of my career in the federal government, I spent some time going around the world to talk to other developing democracies and other kinds of people, and often in Latin America. And my Mexican colleagues would always look at me askance and say, how in the world can you believe that there's no drug money in American politics? How is that even conceivable to you? That sounds really apocryphal, and it makes everybody nervous and a little jingoistic, and I'm never comfortable with those conversations, because I do think we have a genuinely pretty straightforward and for the most part honest process. But it's always the devil you don't know that feels like the one that's the real problem. And there are many more avenues now to be that devil that we just don't know. And there are lots of people with the same kind of incentives that our friends who give $1 million contributions above board have, but that would never do it in that way. So I try to be not so sanguine about this problem, this potential problem, because we don't know.
So since you brought up, sorry, let me move through these. Since you brought up the idea of drugs, drug laundering, that actually leads to my next question in a way, which was on one of your slides, whether or not, when you're talking about freedom partners, whether or not that met the definition of financial money laundering.
Freedom, I don't...
Freedom partners?
The transfers.
The way they're moving all the money through the system.
It depends on what judge or lawyer you talk to. Yeah, I think in a common sense way, I'd absolutely suggest money laundering. And in fact, there is still a law in the books that says you can't give a contribution in the name of someone else. That's overtly defeating the disclosure process, and so therefore it's illegal. And people go to jail for doing that. When you give through an LLC and you create it, you give it money, the money goes to a super PAC, and then it disappears, this LLC. LLC is a new acronym, sorry. These are for-profit organizations, so they don't have the same kind of transparency requirements, even with the IRS, that the social welfare groups have. And that's why they're becoming popular. Yeah, that feels like a contribution in the name of another. And it's a gray area of the law. It's something that needs to be fleshed out in the courts. It's not clear where the boundaries are between actively trying to avoid required disclosure and just participating in the process that doesn't require it. To me, that's the biggest area that we need to clean up, make more straightforward.
Well, and to add, the example Bob used, I believe, is the example that the Fair Political Practices Commission in California got involved, and there were substantial fines. So in some cases, state law has been important here, and state regulators in tracking some of this, and then making or holding people accountable when they're trying to launder money.
Yeah, let me point something out here. We're all friends. We've all written work together. We've all reviewed each other's work. And sometimes we tend to look at things the same way, and once in a while we get blasted from a totally different perspective. And let me give you an example of being blasted. I was giving a talk to a group of people from other countries developing democracies about campaign finance, and a gentleman stood up and he said, you know, all your emphasis on disclosure and transparency and citizenship, that would be the end of our democracy. Because if they disclosed who was donating to the out party, that person would get killed. And in terms of helping a nascent political party that wants to offer a different perspective and a different view on politics, they can't get off the ground without money that we can't get off the ground without money that we get from our relatives who live in the United States, and many of whom have become United States citizens. And then he went on to say, and besides, transparency and money isn't the only thing. In our country, if you vote, they put ink on your finger, and if the wrong people see that you voted, they think you support the political system, and they cut that finger off, or sometimes more. So the way we look at transparency and disclosure is sometimes very different than happens in developing democracies and other places.
Okay. If Jeb Bush does not become the Republican nominee, what does that tell us about the role of the new money in politics, given how much you received in your charts?
Money can't buy you love.
I'll second that.
As Robin said in her presentation, there are good examples in history where the more you spend, the worse you do.
Yes.
And usually it's their own money. Clady Williams was the governor of Texas. And when he ran for re-election, he had more money than anybody in the room, and he would just spend it and spend it and spend it. And the more people saw him on television, the more disgusted they were. And it can happen usually in those circumstances. But we often say, we use these kind of formula or formal kinds of descriptions for this. It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. You have to have enough. Nobody can tell you what enough is in precise terms, but you got to have enough to have your message heard, people can make judgments about you, they can include other things in their calculation, but at least they know where you're coming from and that you're out there as a candidate. But beyond that, the increments of more and more and more and more don't necessarily translate into more.
You know what, the example, it just kind of put it together now with Bush in particular, can speak to the fact that often the candidate who spends the most is the one who needs to spend themselves out of trouble. So in my home state of Pennsylvania, when Rick Santorum got defeated, remember, don't blame us. He lost his last Senate election, his re-election in Pennsylvania by 17 points and outspent now Senator Casey by more than double. And the problem was, if you've got negatives to deal with, you've got to spend a lot of money explaining that. So Jeb Bush may need that money because of his brother and father, especially his brother, to just get him to a neutral point that might be commensurate with others.
I would add that I think the Trump candidacy means the rule book or the normal expectations for a presidential campaign have to be reconsidered. The amount of media attention that he generates without cost is substantial, and I think more than any other of the presidential candidates, he threw Bush off stride in a variety of ways. We watched some of them live with split screens. And so, it's going to be more than just evaluating the money. It's a multivariate equation, and I think in some ways the Trump candidacy might be taken as a reason to believe the money wouldn't have mattered anyway. If Trump weren't part of it and he had it going through the full cycle, it may well have been a very helpful tool to him. So I think there was more going on, and I think the Trump element needs to be factored in.
I would add, Trump is a happy warrior. He's having a great time out there. He's getting a lot of attention, and he's able to do things that establishment candidates can't do because he doesn't have a record that can be pointed to, and he doesn't have the norms of being cautious. Jeb Bush does not come across as a happy warrior. I can, in some ways, liken Trump to Ross Perot, who started out as a happy warrior. In some ways, I can liken Jeb Bush to his father, George H.W. Bush, looking at his watch. When is this debate going to be over? It just doesn't seem to be really enjoying campaigning and getting in touch with the good people of the United States or the good people of Iowa as much as somebody else.
All right, I'll pose one more question, given we have about 5 minutes left, and I'll try and encapsulate a few of the additional questions I've had here. Thank you so much for the question. There's a short version of this question, there's a long version of this question. The short version is, what do we do? What's the way forward? The longer version is, do we have to amend the Constitution to declare that corporations are not citizens? Do we have to go to, say, Lessig's idea of campaign finance and freedom dollars? Or on the other side, do we just lift individual contributions, which the Supreme Court may do at some point? And if we're going to do these things, who do we think should be in charge of deciding what the new system should look like? Is it the courts? Is it the people involved in the campaign contributions? Is it the members of Congress? Perhaps each of you could bite off a chunk of that question.
Don't everybody jump in.
Well, I'll start. I think you have to change the court or change the Constitution. And I don't know that either is a very, well, I know that neither is an easy process, nor a quick one. And the more challenging question, I think, is who should do it. And there, the Constitution, again, means we have to work through the existing institutions. And there's reasons to believe some of those institutions have a self-interest perspective in this whole sphere, which is where we've been with FECA and VICRA and so forth. So it can end up being a pretty discouraging picture. That being said, I personally believe that BICRA was an important step forward, and I think the decisions that have been made since BICRA have substantially undermined it and made it substantially worse. So I think we can make the system marginally better, either with a constitutional amendment or with a change in the perspective on the court.
I'd go for the Constitution too, but in different areas. I'm not so concerned about free speech issues or equality issues. The thing that I learned is spending a year abroad in England, and I've talked to a lot of Europeans, and this is in 2008. The thing that they found most difficult to understand about our system was fixed election times. Now, the reason that so many of these other places that do have, they have their own campaign finance scandals, but they spend considerably less, is that you only know when the election's going to be 6 weeks before. We've created, several people have talked about this, an institution. Pull out your Google Calendar and you can know the next 100 elections because it's going to be the first Tuesday after the first Monday, to the point where, I guess this is starting in the 90s, the party campaign committees, when an election would happen, right, this would be around Thanksgiving, they'd bring all the freshman members to Washington for their orientation, and on day one, it's like, this is how you set up your campaign for the next election. And here's the first fundraiser that you need to do to get ready for what's to come. Well, if you only get 6 weeks' notice, you can do a little bit of the fundraising, but you can't be doing what we do, which is investing so much in the television and the polling and all that at certain moments in time when we know it matters and it doesn't. So what the Europeans, by the way, found so strange about us is that if you recall, George W. Bush's approval ratings in 2006, 2007 were what, lingering around 25%, sometimes even lower. And they said, why is it that you just don't have a vote of no confidence to get rid of this guy? Why do you have to spend 2 more years when 75% of Americans don't want him? And the answer is, in our system, it was still his term. And that's how, we do it, right? We have the terms are very clear. It's very difficult to do that, but in many systems, Italy, the average life of government for a while was 10 months. When they have a serious policy disagreement, they say, let's go to the voters. Greece has been doing that a lot lately.
There's another way to look at this, I think. Maybe doesn't require any of those. Hopefully it doesn't require. And that's to say that maybe the technology takes care of this for us. What you're really talking about is how do we devalue the money? How do we make it that we have a system where I don't care if you give somebody $5 million because it's not going to have that kind of impact that we assume $5 million might have. So maybe it is the fact that you guys only pay attention to social media and don't watch television in real time. Or the fact that the Obama campaign and others since then have shown us that $20 a pop can turn into real money. That hundreds of millions of dollars can be raised from normal Americans in very modest sums over a period of time, and that you can overwhelm those $5 million checks with other kinds of resources. That's really what I mean by devaluing the money. So maybe our politics and the way we conduct our politics will change with new technologies that help to do that.
I would say, what do we do? Well, I'm definitely not a fan of the courts deciding. I think in some ways they're so smart they can say things that the rest of us don't understand and don't believe, such as speech and TV ads and money are the same, and corporations, which never die, are like people. Amending the Constitution is really hard to do, harder than passing a law. I agree, we probably all would agree that competition is good in an election, and it's good to have some kind of system where challengers have resources to compete. And technology does help them raise money, and it does help them reach out, and it does in a less expensive way. Whose views should we reflect? The donors, the public, the candidates? Maybe a couple decades ago, actually, I worked with several people. Bob was helped with this. We did a survey of people who give money. I followed up later on with a survey of everyone who ran for office, and then a survey of those who won and served in Congress. And wouldn't you know it, everybody was highly critical of the campaign finance system. The candidates, the members of Congress, the significant donors, the public all overwhelmingly didn't like what we had. They just disagreed on where we ought to go. So every nation has sort of a dialogue, kind of a caricature. Canada, breaking up is hard to do. We hear that because the Quebecois constantly looking to leave. A lot of third world countries, you turn against me and I will kill you. In the United States, it's the best government money can buy. It's money in politics. And I think we'll always have that dialogue because of the nature of our political system and because we are, depending on which economist you talk to, a capitalist or a post capitalist nation. But I would just remind you that this is part of a bigger system of elections. And elections are about conferring power. And our system may not look so beautiful under the microscope, but think of the alternatives. Murdering the leader, co-optation by elites, as happens in Russia, but also the Vatican. Aristocracy, monarchy. People don't get much of a voice like that, and worst of all, a coup d'etat or a revolution where blood spills in the street. So if we make you feel a little discouraged, just remember how great our option for conferring power is, our technique compared to other places. I think it's a pretty good thing, and I think our dialogue about money in politics is very good in that it checks the role of money in politics.
Well, it seems very nice to end on optimistic, hopeful note. Why don't we give a big round of applause to our panelists?